this is a situation where the technology of the internet is undermining social cohesion in a serious way. And this undermining of social cohesion plays out in politics with the kind of politics that we now see.
Welcome to Beg to Differ, the Bulwark's weekly roundtable discussion featuring civil conversation across the political spectrum. We range from center-left to center-right. I'm Will Salatan, and I'm sitting in this week for Mona Charan, who's out this week. I'm joined by our regulars, Bill Galston of the Wall Street Journal and the Brookings Institution, Linda Chavez of the Niskanen Center, and Damon Linker, who writes the Substack newsletter, Notes from the Middle Ground. This week, our special guest is Tom Edsall, a New York Times columnist who has covered politics in Washington for the past 50 years, and who is, in my opinion, one of the smartest people in this business. We're honored to have you with us, Tom.
It's good to be here.
So since I'm only the substitute today, I'm giving all of you a free pass, which is if you don't like the question I'm asking you, you can answer the question you wish I had asked you. And in fact, if you want to take another crack at the question I asked somebody before you, go for it. Let's start with the first topic of the week, which is immigration. So 2 weeks ago, President Biden issued an executive order to restrict asylum for people who are just now crossing the border. And basically, they'd be turned back instead of being allowed into the United States to wait for their asylum hearing. When Biden did that, critics on the left accused him of being just like Donald Trump. And it was seen as a concession to a political shift in this country, that voters wanted a stricter immigration policy. But this week, Biden is tacking back to the left. On Tuesday, he issued another executive action, and this time it is designed to make life easier, not just for asylum applicants, but for undocumented immigrants. The new executive action announced on Tuesday would grant legal protection to about 500,000 people in the United States who are undocumented, but who are married to American citizens. These people would be protected from deportation, allowed to apply for work visas, eventually legal status, and eventually 5 years afterwards for citizenship. So let me start with you, Linda Chavez. You are a senior fellow at the National Immigration Forum. You're very familiar with these issues. On the merits, is this move from Joe Biden a good idea or a bad idea?
So it was not only a good thing to do, it was absolutely the right thing to do. And the question is whether or not it is going to survive legal challenge. Definitely, there will be governors around the country, including Governor Abbott in Texas and elsewhere, who are going to challenge. But the president does have the authority to do what is called parole in place. So these are all people who've been here at least a decade. And by the way, the average number of years that many people who are in this category have lived here is 2 decades. Some of these people are DACA recipients. They are people who came here as children. I think one of them was featured at the press conference with President Biden this week. And because Congress has chosen not to ask, this is really the only way that you can give these folks the help that they need. It's good for the economy. These are people who are working, they're paying taxes, or they're in higher institutions of learning, and they are contributing members to our society. But I think the real concern is that this is coming at the wake of a lot of people who are crossing the borders to claim asylum in the United States. And by the way, there was a record last year, 2.4 million people came. But I want to put it in perspective a minute. Back during the height of the immigration flood into the United States between 1900 and 1915, 1 million people a year were coming. That's when we had a population of 92 million people. So yes, we had 2.4 million people who were encountered at the border. Not all of those people actually made it into the United States. 700,000 were in fact returned, and some of the people who were encountered more than once. But let's say that it was 1.5 million people coming. If you look at our population now, it's 335 million people. We would have to be taking in newcomers at the rate of 3.6 or 3.7 million each and every year to be able to match what we were doing at the beginning of the 20th century. So I think it does need to be put into perspective. We do want people to come legally because we can vet them, because we can ensure that the people are coming in are the people that we want. But unless Congress decides to actually tackle this issue and pass legislation, there aren't very many ways for people to come in. And our immigration levels have been falling in recent years. And we actually need these people for our economy.
Bill Galston, do you agree with Linda? Do you have any differences with her?
On the merits, no. But there's also a political dimension. And I think that if Biden had done this 2 years ago, it would have had a huge impact on both the economy and his political standing. My fear is that here, as in so many other instances, you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. These two moves taken together, I think, constitute the strongest cards that President Biden had to play. I don't think there will be other fundamental alterations of immigration policy between now and the election. And the question from a political standpoint is whether these moves, I think each of which can be justified on policy grounds, will end up having the political consequences that they would have had if this issue hadn't been allowed to fester for so long. And I think many people will point out the obvious, and that is there's nothing that President Biden has done in the past 2 weeks that he couldn't have done 2 years ago. And so I think it amounts to something close to political malpractice that this wasn't done 2 years ago when the magnitude of the problem was pretty obvious.
Let me turn to you, Damon Linker. It looks like Biden is being generous to people who came here illegally many, many years ago, but he's getting tough on people who are just now arriving, even if they're just applying for asylum. So 2 questions. First of all, morally, do you think that's fair, that distinction? And secondly, as a practical matter, are Republicans correct when they say that this move, the one to allow people to stay who've been here for a long time and are married, are they correct that this move will be seen by migrants today as more amnesty and another reason to come to the United States?
Well, what's wrong with amnesty? Oh, sorry, I've dated myself. I'm old enough to remember Ronald Reagan being in favor of amnesty. I'm not that interested, frankly, in the question of whether it's right or wrong, purely in moral terms, simply because it's not an academic debate. It is a political thing, and politics overlaps with morality, but not completely. I think it's clearly a moral thing to do to people who've been here for a decade or more, have families and jobs, and have made lives in this country, to offer them a chance to normalize their status and end up as members of our country, above board. And if you want to call that amnesty, I say fine. I also would remind listeners that even Donald Trump at various moments in his presidency expressed an openness to some kind of a deal like that, to which the nativists in the party, exploded in rage. I'm sure he got testy memos from Stephen Miller from down the hall about this. But even he recognized that there is kind of a distinction here. These are people who have been here for a long time. DACA is in this kind of muddled position when it comes to these debates. And I do think can and should, for the purposes of politics, be separated from the other issue of whether we as a polity control our own borders and make decisions about who gets in and who does not. And I think that is the issue that is so politically fraught for Democrats. It's not that we're a party of bleeding hearts who care about people who immigrated here 15 years ago and want to let them in and not have to live underground and breaking the law and so forth. It's this worry that somehow Democrats are such bleeding hearts that they sort of don't ever want to say no. And there's an inclination that I think is a sound one, that a country has within its rights deciding who gets in and who doesn't. And it's precisely the lawlessness of the border situation that really hurts Democrats, because it makes it look like they're not willing to enforce the law on the books and say, we decide as Americans who gets in and who does not. We don't basically let anybody in. So I think all along, going back, all the way to the deal that almost passed after the 2012 election, but didn't in the kind of early boiling of Trumpist feelings among Republicans, and basically ate Marco Rubio's career alive. All the way back to there, if not before, there's been this inclination that really what we need to do is create a path to citizenship for people who are here and combine that with being tougher on the border. And it keeps failing in Congress. And Biden has sort of ended up doing those two things in this last 2 weeks. I agree with Bill that it could very well be too late to have great political benefit. But I do think that this is the position that the Democrats want to be in. And so, even if it's too late, I'd say better late than never on substance and on the politics.
Okay, so let me follow up on your point about the politics and your point too, Bill. I'll ask this question to you, Tom Edsall. The White House and the Biden campaign have signaled in several articles about this new executive action that they're going to frame the debate around family unity versus family separation. And they want to change the debate from which candidate, Biden or Trump, is soft on the border or tough on the border to which candidate will keep families together. So when Biden announced the executive action on Tuesday, he said, I'll just read you a couple of his quotes. He said that when Trump was president, he separated families and children at the border. Biden said, and now Trump proposing to rip spouses and children from their families and homes and communities and place them in detention camps. So, Tom, my question to you is, politically, do you think that this strategy will work? Will it change the way that key groups of voters see the issue and the contrast between Trump and Biden?
I don't think it's going to work very well. Let me put it that way. Biden has basically adopted two stands, one tough, one loving. And I think for the voters, he remains muddled, and I don't think it's going to effectively resolve his problems. He was going to be a tough guy and impose border restrictions on those seeking safety and security. And now he's saying that he wants to keep families together. These both may be good policies, but I think together they create a muddled image of left and right. And they don't, I think Damon's point about the Democratic Party being seen as a party that can't basically restrict itself, that it overflows all the time. This really, he had started to address that with the first set of policies about the border, but now this pushes him back to the left. And I think this may help, and the policies may well be good, but I don't think it's going to solve politically his problem with the border. And I think it's just going to keep coming back at him, to tell you the truth.
Could I just step in here, Will,
Sure.
for a second? Because I think I understand Tom's point, but these are not newcomers. These are not more people coming into the country. These are people who are in place. So what you're really doing is getting people able to work legally. All of us should be in favor of that. I mean, one of the canards we hear about immigrants is, oh, they come here to go on welfare. They're going to, be put on public assistance. They're not eligible for public assistance, even if they're legal immigrants, and certainly not if they're not here legally. But the fact is, they are here. Would you not rather that they be working above ground, not in the underground economy or on somebody else's social security number? The question is whether or not people can be made to understand that. And that is part of the whole problem. We have a kind of collective amnesia about immigration. We think we're the great immigrant country and we've always loved immigrants, but we love the ones who came here the right way. Well, those 1 million a year that were coming in the year 1900 were coming the same way as people come today. They were showing up and crossing over the border. We had no laws to restrict immigration. It does require an education campaign, and I frankly think the business community has to step up more because they are the people who are reliant on these folks to do jobs, many of them jobs that Americans either are unwilling to do or in some cases aren't trained to do.
Well, Linda, I hear you making an argument on the merits that requires some subtlety, some sophistication about drawing these distinctions. And Tom, I hear you saying that you're skeptical that voters will hear that difference, that they'll just see a muddle. Do you think that Linda's right, that voters can be persuaded of this?
I think it's like Bill said, we're very late in the game now, and the image that Biden has on immigration has been pretty well imprinted, and he's trying to change an image of 3 years in a matter of 5 months. Trump has been pounding on this. I think Linda is right on the merits, but an education campaign at this stage is just very hard to start, and you're going to find business very reluctant to engage what they will see as a political issue, especially after they've been scared about transgenderism and they've had problems every time they've moved in lately. The polarization we have now makes it very difficult for outside groups to engage on these kind of issues for fear that they're going to alienate one side or the other. I'm a born pessimist. My sense is that I've been borne out over all my 50 years covering politics.
Could I add a thought or two? I think that Biden's best play at this point, starting with the debates, is to turn immigration from a referendum on him into a choice between him and Trump. Let me explain what I mean. Trump isn't talking much about the wall this time. The substitute for the wall is his proposal to round up, intern, and deport between 10 and 15 million people that he says are here illegally. I have a hunch that the severity of that was not going to sit particularly well with the with the voters who are going to make a difference, because it really will involve, very direct and granular intrusion into communities, into homes, dragging people away, from neighborhoods where they've lived for 10 years or more. And so, people are unhappy with Biden on the immigration issue, and they're going to stay unhappy with him on the issue, in my judgment. The question is whether he has anything to put on the other side of the scale, and I think he may. I'm not sure. There are some surveys that show majority support for, the roundup, intern, and deport strategy. I have to say that intuitively, I'm not sure that the American people are exactly there. And the more they think about it, the more it's visualized, I think the less likely they will be to stay there. Now, whether Biden can or will do that, I don't know. But it strikes me as a better strategy for him than saying, well, yeah, maybe it took me a little bit too long, but I've now done two good things to deal with the issue.
Damon, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I'm willing to let it lie that way. I think I've said my piece, and I think everyone has made good points. It's a tough issue.
Okay. The only thing that I would add to this is I'm quite torn on the topic because as a pundit, I sympathize with Tom's pessimistic take. You never go broke betting on people lacking nuance in their judgments. So, but on the merits, I agree. I agree with Linda. I agree with all of you. The distinction is relevant here. These people have been here for a while. They've established, roots in this country. They are Americans, and so I think morally there's a good case to be made for it. Can we go on to topic number 2, which is the backlash against social media and cell phones? So on Tuesday, the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, called for a crackdown on social media. He wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and what he wrote was, quote, "It is time to require a Surgeon General's warning label on social media platforms," stating that social media is associated with significant mental health harms for adolescents. The warning label would appear on your screen anytime you go to a social media website. And the justification for this warning, he wrote, was, quote, "Adolescents who spend more than 3 hours a day on social media face double the risk of anxiety and depression symptoms. And the average daily use in this age group as of the summer of 2023 was 4.8 hours. So let me start with you, Damon. Is the Surgeon General right about this? Should we do what he is proposing?
I say sure. I actually wanted to begin by just tipping my hat to Jonathan Haidt, as he deserves some kind of award for most impactful public intellectual of the decade, I think. I mean, he's, of course, the social psychologist from New York University who has a book out making this case, and he's marshaled a lot of data in favor of the case for limiting exposure to social media among teenagers, showing how right when we had the explosion of cell phones, smartphones, and social media around 2012, 2013, we started to see a surge of depression and other problems in teens. And he makes, I think, a very compelling case. And here we see a very rapid, his book only came out a few months ago, and already the Surgeon General's jumping on board. We see governors taking a look at this. Now, let me say that what this really comes down to is parents in the end. This really is a warning for parents to see, so that they will then get involved and start actually, dropping the boom on the cell phone usage. And I don't know how successful it will be, because we parents are at least as guilty as our kids. They are mirroring what they see from us. Parents who sit at the dinner table with their kids and the cell phone's there and they're doing stuff. And so, of course, the kids are going to do it too, in addition to their peers doing it. So this is like standing a little bit like, holding your hand up in front of a wave and hoping you can stop it. I'm a little skeptical that it'll have that big of an impact, but there are signaling things that go on in these cases. I do think that the Surgeon General warnings on cigarettes eventually did lead to a kind of sea change in public health. The message gets out, it gets echoed, it gets reinforced over, months and years and eventually decades, and it can make a difference. And I'm fully in favor of pushing back on this, because I do think the evidence is compelling. You can never say it's everything, but I do think it's a lot. There's something real here, and I'm glad the Surgeon General stepped into the fray to at least begin this process of reevaluating where we are on these things.
Okay, I want to pick up on one of the words you said there, which was cigarettes. It's a little weird to have the Surgeon General talking about social media as opposed to something like a chemical. But he is explicitly comparing social media to tobacco. So, Bill Galston, I want to ask you about that. The Surgeon General wrote, quote, that push notifications, autoplay, and infinite scroll, these features of social media, prey on developing brains and contribute to excessive use. He wrote that kids who use social media describe, quote, a feeling of being addicted and unable to set limits. And he also wrote that, quote, evidence from tobacco studies show that warning labels can increase awareness and change behavior. Bill, do you think this is a legitimate analogy? To what extent is it legitimate to regulate social media the way we regulate tobacco?
May not be a perfect analogy, but it's good enough, in my view. And let me suggest the obvious place to begin, a place where we've already begun to see results. An increasing number of schools and even school districts are saying no cell phones during the school day. If you bring them to school, you have to turn them in and then they're sealed in some sort of high-tech bag, and you get to reclaim them at the end of the day. And I've read reports from teachers on the front line who say that the effects on their classrooms have been close to magical, that it took about a week or two. And then it turns out the kids are paying more attention, A. B, they're talking to one another in a very old-fashioned way, face to face. That they seem to be more social during the lunch hour, et cetera, et cetera. And and I really don't care whether the analogy is perfect. As I said, not only is it good enough, but there is an immediate plausible intervention that doesn't define the problem as putting kids at odds with their parents and forcing parents into an enforcement job that will make their lives living with tweens and teens even more difficult than they already are. I'm not saying that parents don't have a role to play and that they shouldn't be disciplinarians, but frankly, if we could get cell phones out of the hands of kids for 7 or 8 hours, 5 days a week, that would be a huge step forward, both developmentally and, I believe, pedagogically. So I'm 100% with the Surgeon General, and at least directionally on what he's recommending.
Okay, so let me follow up on that. So, Tom, I'll ask you this question. So Bill is talking about the movement to crack down on cell phones in schools. And this is all over the country. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, just called for a statewide ban on students using smartphones in schools. Meanwhile, Ron DeSantis, who was literally the governor debating Gavin Newsom in the red state, blue state debate. So on the right, Ron DeSantis signed last year a law that bans students from using smartphones in class. That law also blocks access to social media on school Wi-Fi networks. And we have many other states going into this. Indiana, Utah's moving in this direction, New York. I mean, we're bouncing all over the political spectrum. 3 states where bans are under consideration: Oklahoma, Virginia, and Vermont. So this is all across the political spectrum. Why is that, Tom? What are the constituencies in the 2 parties that are pushing in this direction? And are there any constituencies, or is there any political force in the country that seems capable of standing in the way of this new movement?
I think that I haven't seen any real opposition, but that the opposition would be from libertarian high-tech folks. But I don't think they've really organized or expressed opposition. I think what's happened now is that this is as Bill says, a very effective tool to alter the way education has been going. And education has had a lot of troubles, and this is clearly appears to be something that works. I'm not sure about the putting a warning label on having that much effect, but I think that the banning from schools has so far shown very strong effectiveness. I think one of the issues, though, is that it's part of a much, much, much larger problem, and that has been the whole notion of parenting has been too close. Kids are not allowed to play. the way schools run is so protective and so fearful of liability that there's a lot of other things that could be done that are not quite as clear as this. This is sort of a black and white situation, I think, and Jonathan Haidt has really caught on to something that's a very very liable to reform. But there are, I think, larger characteristics that are sort of socially pervasive in the way people bring up kids, especially the way liberals bring up kids, that have debilitating effects on their ability to have a sense of mastery, a sense of control. There's a whole concept of locus of control that I think captures a lot of what is missing right now. And I would, this is sort of too vague and too large, but I think liberalism has this problem in spades at this point.
Okay, so one of the points you made, Tom, is that the warning label itself is fairly mild. That's not whereas the bans on the phones in school, that's a concrete thing that will directly affect access and use. So let me follow up on that because we're all agreeing too much at this point. I want to see if I can raise anybody's hackle. So I'll go to you, Linda. So in addition to the warning label idea, the Surgeon General wrote that, quote, legislation from Congress should restrict the use of features like push notifications, autoplay, and infinite scroll, which those are the things that prey on developing brains and contribute to excessive use. So that's not just a warning label, right? That is a government crackdown on how the social media sites are allowed to deliver content to consumers, young ones, but consumers. So does that go too far? Or do features like autoplay and infinite scroll manipulate people in ways that the government can legitimately regulate?
I think it's going to be very difficult for the government to regulate. I want to get back to the role of parents. And I think everybody just caved on the idea, oh, well, parents can't do much about this. Their kids are being hated. I'm sorry. Who is it that buys the phones for these kids in the first place? And then who is it that pays the monthly exorbitant fees? I have grandkids who are in this age bracket, and their parents are literally paying hundreds of dollars a month to be able to get each of the kids on their, unlimited data plan. And I would think that there ought to be a movement, something like what we saw with Tippi Gore back in the old days when the fear then was the kind of misogynistic and sometimes racist lyrics and obscene lyrics that were going out over the airwaves. They were discs or tapes, but the idea that we can't come up with a way to allow parents more control over what their kids get. We have phones now for people in my age bracket. They're not smartphones. They're sort of dumb phones. They do certain things. They allow certain access, but they don't allow lots of complicated access. And coming up, I would think even capitalism could come up with how many parents out there would value being able to buy a device for their kid where the kid could be, reachable when they're not at home, would have some basis and access to certain kinds of features, but not unlimited.
Well, my kids are no longer of the age where I could easily do that. They are. My daughter is now 21 and my son is 23. They're both at home with us right now. And the only point that I would make about parenting is I asked my kids last night about this topic and did they think the Surgeon General's move was a good idea, both parts of it, the warning label and restricting these features of the social media sites. My daughter's response was, I use my phone all the time and yes, I need to be using it less. And my son's response was nothing because I could not get him to look up from his phone and answer the question. So
are they still on your data plan, Will? That's the question I want.
They are while they're here. Yes, they are.
Yeah. Okay. So I got a note in the chat room. There is something called jitterbugs, apparently, for kids, which I was unaware of.
could I just raise the broader issue behind all of this? Uh, the statistics that I think we've all seen suggest that for whatever reason, today's teens and tweens are in the throe of mental health difficulties, which some regard as a mental health crisis, uh, to an extent that you know parents doubt was the case in previous generations, parents and grandparents. And that's the backdrop against which all of these proposals are being received. I think there's something like desperation in the country to figure out effective interventions that are compatible with non wartime relationships between parents and their children. Uh, and I'm with Linda in principle. Yes, parents are very, very important. But I've noticed that in practice, and this I think will turn out to be true, even in my very Orthodox Jewish son and daughter-in-law's house as our four grandchildren are evolving towards tweenhood and even teenhood. There really has to be a rule of reason here. There's some battles that you can fight and hope to win, and others where the input of strife relative to the output of improvement may be a poor ratio. Uh, but that's an individual judgment.
Bill, I was really struck when the Surgeon General wrote this op-ed articulating the need for the warning label. He used the word emergency. You were speaking about the mental health crisis,
Yep.
And it was really striking to me because I think a lot of us sort of say, well, there's a problem out there. But he actually wrote that he said, one of the most important lessons I learned in medical school was that in an emergency, you don't have the luxury to wait for perfect information. You have to use your best judgment and act quickly. The mental health crisis among young people is an emergency. And I've never seen this said about a technological phenomenon, about communications technology. I've seen it in medical situations, as he's alluding to as his analogy. But I was really surprised to see that. And do all of you agree that this is an emergency?
If I can jump in briefly, I mean, I allow the Surgeon General to talk that way simply because that's the way we all talk now. This is like typical. My next post for my Substack is about our addiction to hyperbole. And this is an example of that. Is it an emergency? I don't know. What is an emergency? How do we decide this? I think everyone feel and this is itself downstream from the explosion of social media over the last decade, that like the public square is so loud with so many people shouting that the only way that any individual's opinion is going to get heard, even if you're the Surgeon General of the United States, is if you shout, which of course leads the din to be even louder, which requires then more shouting later. So everything's a crisis, everything's an emergency, it's the end of this, and so forth. I'm a critic of this. I think it's contributing to some of the really bad things in our politics and culture. However, I'll let it slide with the Surgeon General because I'm sure he has a staff of communications experts who are saying, if you're going to write an op-ed, you got to call it an emergency. It's the only way anyone's going to read what you write.
Okay, so I will cop to being part of the hyperbole crisis in this country. At the Bulwark, we say every day that America is in crisis, the crisis of democracy. We're going to lose our democracy any day. So let me turn to that for our third topic. The topic of political polarization and the threat to democratic norms. So Tom has a very good and very thorough column in the Times this week about this problem. He tries to explain the current research in political science about what's happening in the minds of Americans that is causing so many of us to reject unfavorable election results, reject unfavorable court rulings, to rationalize, in some cases, political violence and intimidation, and to support other anti-democratic ideas like reducing the number of polling stations in red or blue areas. So Tom, can you start by explaining to the rest of us some of this research and what it tells us? And in particular, can you explain some of the mental components that the researchers are talking about, which they call othering and aversion and moralization?
Well, there had been a lot of discussion. This gets down somewhat into the weeds on the concept of affective polarization. The people don't differ on issues so much as they have an emotional hostility to their adversaries. It's an affective, emotional way of viewing left and right, Democrats and Republicans. There has been some question, though, raised by some very good people saying this affective polarization does not link to anti-democratic attitudes, a willingness to do what you just described, things like gerrymandering, cutting out polling places, and going further even of rejecting election results. Since then, there has been some very interesting new work which identifies a concept similar but different from affective polarization, and this is what they call partisan sectarianism, where people have viewed the other party, and they've boiled it down to 9 measures. I don't know if I can remember all of them, but one of them is aversion, where they measure the degree that you just don't like, you want to be away from and distant from the opposition. Another is moralization, where you see that the other side is immoral, evil, vindictive, and to be honest, I can't remember the third. But this concept, I think, illuminates better than what we've seen earlier what underlies the political hostility. And political hostility obviously has become a central fact in American life. Another thing that I think is interesting, and it's relevant to this discussion of the social media, is that 2 NYU scholars, Claire Robertson and Jay Van Bevel, psychologists there, have done work on how the internet really distorts basic evolved human capacities to be compassionate to those who are harmed and punitive to those who do the harming. The internet, one, puts all those, it creates a constant barrage of harm and insult and punishing, but it does so at a distance that no individual can really address it except by voicing this, again, furthering the whole process on the internet. And secondly, it creates a world where people see social norms of violence and harm as much more acceptable than they are in reality. And so, again, this is a situation where the technology of the internet is undermining social cohesion in a serious way. And this undermining of social cohesion plays out in politics with the kind of politics that we now see. I'll leave it at that, but there's a lot more to these arguments.
Okay, so Bill Galston, I'm going to go to you next. You may want to pick your own theme out of what Tom just brought up, but I'm going to put on the table a part of what he writes about in the article, and you can comment on this or someone else can. One of the problems he identifies in the column is the connection between polarization or political animosity, this partisan sectarianism, and the decline of self-policing within political parties. So Tom quotes an email from very well-known political scientist Shanto Iyengar, in which Iyengar worries that, quote, partisans have come to view the opposing party in such harsh terms that they are unwilling to sanction leaders of their own party who engage in unethical or illegal activity. And Iyengar points to a recent survey in which 62% of Republicans said they were prepared to vote for a candidate who faced allegations of sexual harassment. More than 40% would vote for a convicted felon. More than 40% said they would vote for a candidate who compromised national security. And Iyengar said that there was, quote, a huge partisan divide with Republicans much more likely to ignore these things. So to what extent do you think the partisan hostility accounts for this loss of self-policing within the Republican Party, or to what extent do you think other factors are more salient?
Look, I sat down, as I always do, and read Tom's most recent article very carefully. And in order to unravel, the relationship among the various studies, I'd have to spend weeks and weeks reading them and asking each one of the authors to comment on the other research in the field, etc. Tom's article provides a wonderful empirical basis for doing that, but I'd really have to put in a lot of work to be able to answer your question at a social science level of rigor. So let me just revert to informal punditry and say that it seems to me obvious that the worse you think would be the consequences for the country of the other side taking control, the more likely you are to make excuses for the misdeeds of your own side. The stakes are too high to allow those misdeeds to get in the way of the overall objectives, which is to save the country from those evil people on the other side. And I think from that standpoint, uh, I think there's a certain symmetry between the two political parties at this point. Namely, each party, for different reasons, believes that a takeover by the other party would entail catastrophe for the country. And that's half of the answer. The other half of the answer is do not overlook the impact of sheer cowardice and careerism in preventing people in one party from sanctioning someone in their own party, especially if you're going up against the strongest force in your own party, which in the Republican case is Donald Trump. If you're dealing with someone who has a vast mass following and an unbridled desire to take revenge on people who cross him, how many of the people who voted against him a couple of years ago are still in public life? Very few. He's carried out an extremely effective purge. So a lot of people are saying to themselves, is it really worth this career that I've cultivated for decades? I'll just keep my mouth shut and hope that down the road we can temper this guy's excesses a little bit. Why should I fall on my sword? That's at least as important as effective polarization.
Well, Bill, I'm not going to let you shame me out of simplistic takes on this. So let me move over to the other thing that Tom brought up, which was the internet. And Linda, I'll go to you on this. One of the authors that Tom quotes in his column writes, quote, "The unnatural or supernormal scale and distance of the internet distorts basic moral processes like the instincts for compassion and punishment." This author writes, I think this was Robertson, writes that, quote, "Punishing moral transgressors was adaptive in small groups by signaling to others that bad behavior is not acceptable and deterring future cheaters. However, quote, the scale at which people are punished online becomes out of proportion for their crime." And another of the papers that Tom quotes says, "The internet amplifies extremism because the most highly motivated people are the ones who post nearly all the political tweets." And then, as Tom said, everybody else, when they see that content, thinks that that's a representative sample of how the other half of the country thinks, right? So do you think, or let's put it this way, to what extent do you think the internet is to blame for the increase in partisanship and partisan sectarianism? And if so, what can we do about it?
I think it's complicated. Well, I mean, I think that one of the things the internet has done is it has allowed us to create communities of like-minded people without a whole lot of effort. In the past, we drew our cues from our neighbors, our coworkers, our people who attended the same church or synagogue, and there was a lot of social reinforcement. And now, if somebody misbehaved in a setting, in a community or at church, and somebody stood up and started cursing in church, everyone around that person would scold them and make them sit down. Now you can essentially do the same thing, but you do it anonymously or pseudo-anonymously on the internet. But you also find people who will, in fact, reinforce that bad behavior. So I think that's one of the reasons that it's so polarizing. And I do think it's made things worse. Would it have been, would the Trump phenomena have been the same without Twitter? Would he have been able to gather the kind of the number of followers? He already had a head start because he had a reality television program where he had literally millions of people who watched him and who thought they knew him. But had he run for office in another era in 1980, for example, if he'd run in the primary against Ronald Reagan, he would have been laughed off the stage. So it is easier, and it has made things worse. And frankly, it is a threat to democracy because democracies only survive if you have a population that agrees on the rules, agrees to respect the rules, agrees to respect laws, agrees to respect authority, and who, for example, when a jury hands down a verdict, accepts that verdict. And there's been a huge decline in the number of people among Republicans who are willing to accept jury verdicts. It's now less than half.
Okay, so I agree with much of what you guys have said. And Damon, I'm going to come to you with the impossible constructive question. So there was a big story in the New York Times on Sunday about national and local projects to bridge this partisan divide. Among other things, several foundations have just awarded millions of dollars to various civic organizations that are working to, this is some of the terms in the article, foster dialogue and respect, rebuild community, reinforce democratic values. Barack Obama linked to this story and said these groups are models of how to, as he put it, rebuild a conversation and promote constructive debate without people hating each other. But there's a catch. Some of these groups are saying in the article that the people who pose the biggest problem, the most zealous or extreme people, don't show up to these gatherings. So do you think there's any hope here? What kinds of projects do you think are most likely to alleviate the problem we're talking about?
I'm usually the last person you want to talk to about constructive proposals. I'm famously the guy who, when I turn in a book manuscript, the editor's like, "You forgot to put in the solutions part," and I say, "I'm not doing that. I never promised that," and then we have a big fight about it. I'm at a loss, and there are a number of reasons why. I mean, obviously we're a big country, have a vibrant civil society. If there are people with the resources to fund the kind of programs you're talking about, well, by all means, try it. Continue the effort. I make efforts in my own classroom when I teach at Penn. I teach politics, and we deal with some pretty radical things on the left and the right and the thinkers we read and discuss. And in that respect, I try to sort of position myself above the conversation and don't tip my hat. In that sense, I'm a kind of classical liberal, epistemologically speaking. I sort of am a facilitator of debate. I make sure the students understand what each of the people we've read said and make the most cogent case for each of their sides and let the students try to figure it out and muddle their way through to figure out what they believe. I don't try to shove a predetermined ideological response down their throats. I think that's a good model in my own work, and I think more broadly could be a model of kind of fairness in conversation and debate to make sure that each side is heard before we enter the fray and shout them down. And maybe we'll do a little less shouting if we've been fair about it in the earlier stage. But the bigger problem, to delve just to one kind of slice of the kinds of research that Tom cited in his very good Times piece, the people in America who are kind of least polarized, the people in the center, are also the people who tend to be least informed. And so this is a paradox that comes out in the tidbit that you added right before you turned to me, that the people who most need to have a form of moderation modeled for them are the people who know the most about politics and are most passionately committed to being right about what they think. And so they would be most capable of shouting down their opponents on the other side. So they don't want to moderate. They don't want to hear the kind of complications of the middle. Whereas the people in the middle who kind of are open to this complication are precisely that way because they don't really care and don't think about it much. It doesn't come up much in their lives. And so it's as if, if we're going to hell as a country, it's because of the people who are most civically engaged. And that's a kind of weird kind of paradox of classical Republican thought. The idea of Republican government, back around the time that America was founded, thought that what you needed to foster was engaged citizens who cared and were public spirited and informed about issues. And you wanted to foster that, but we've ended up in a situation all these centuries later where the people who are most like that are the ones who are kind of driving us off a cliff. Or toward a kind of virtual civil war conducted all on the platform X or something like this. So I guess I'll leave it at that and note that I've totally skirted your request for a concrete proposal for improvement, but that's my MO.
Not only are you allowed to skirt it, but I'm going to illustrate the most cynical point you made. Here we are having this, as Mona says, civil conversation from center left to center right, and none of us is part of this problem of polarization that we're describing in these other folks. They're not in the conversation. Let me move on to the low light and the highlight, or the highlight of the week. Everybody gets to choose one. Bill, let's start with you.
Well, I have a highlight and a low light. For me, the highlight of the week was the publication in the venerable journal Foreign Affairs of an article by Robert C. O'Brien, who was President Trump's national security advisor. The title of the article is "The Return of Peace Through Strength: Making the Case for Trump's Foreign Policy." And I commend it to everybody who's interested in what a coherent articulation of Trumpism in foreign policy amounts to. You're not going to get it from Mr. Trump himself, but you will get it from Robert O'Brien, and you can see both the strengths and weaknesses of the case that he's making. I think it's required reading. That's the highlight. The low light for me, as is so frequently the case, is a survey, a public opinion poll. The Emerson organization, a respected survey research organization, released a swing state poll today that showed President Biden and former President Trump tied in the state of Minnesota. Now, I would point out that President Biden carried Minnesota by 7.2 percentage points just 3.5 years ago. And so the fact that we're now seeing a tie in Minnesota ought to ring alarm bells, throughout the Democratic establishment. If Trump is not only leading in the swing states, but also widening the number of swing states, then Democrats are in even more trouble than they now imagine. I'm not saying that in the same way that one swallow doesn't make a summer, one poll doesn't make a panic. But when you consider the fact that in the poll of polls, Joe Biden is ahead in Minnesota by only 1.7 percentage points, this is something for Democrats to ponder and to act upon before it's too late.
Linda, what is your highlight or low light of the week?
Well, my highlight of the week was actually an article by Karl Rove that appeared in the Wall Street Journal. He is often a very astute analyst of American politics, and the article was entitled Experts Handicap the Trump-Biden Debate. And in it, Karl apparently interviewed, I think it was 5 Republicans and 3 Democrats, so-called experts, to get their opinion. But I have a feeling that a lot of what was in the article was his own. And I thought he made a very good case. And if both Biden and Trump were to look at this article and to take to heart some of what he suggested, it would be a much better debate, but also one that I think, might actually help influence voters. And one of the biggest things he said was that each of the candidates should try to make a list of 3 issues and only 3 issues that they would take on and messages that they wanted to convey to the voting public. And I doubt that Trump is capable of following that advice. He can't actually utter a sentence, much less a paragraph, without meandering all around in a way that makes me think if there is a candidate who has dementia, it's Mr. Trump and not Mr. Biden. But Biden could take it to heart. And I think he needs to sit down and be focused. And he, even suggests to Biden how to handle the question of the conviction. He shouldn't skirt it, but neither should he, I think, hammer it over and over again. And he talks about basically remembering that it is only the independent or undecided voters that either of these men should be speaking to, because the base of the Republican Party's mind can't be changed. The only thing that's going to matter for the Democrats is whether they can get their base out. But it really is going to be the swing voters. So anyway, I thought it was a very good article.
Okay. Damon, what is your highlight or low light?
I guess we're going big on articles this week. I have a couple of New York Times op-eds that I liked this week that I want to highlight, partly building off a comment I made on the last podcast toward the end about disliking protests and activism. I'm kind of down on that. I think we have a little too much of it. I think there are now there's like an ecosystem, especially on the left, of special interest groups and donor-sponsored organizations that kind of exist to create protests, and I think that they tend to force complicated issues down to slogans that get chanted at events, and they are often counterproductive and so forth. So I made that point last week, and then lo and behold, this week I see the Times opinion section is coming on board with this a little bit, because in Thursday's Times, at least online, there are 2 op-eds that make kind of variations on this kind of an argument. One by Pamela Paul, the former editor of the New York Times Book Review, who's now an opinion columnist, has a good piece titled "No, I Don't Want to Protest." And then Sarah Isgur, who is a center-right writer and lawyer who works for the Dispatch. She has an op-ed titled "Why Activists Keep Failing the Causes That Fire Them Up." Both are very good, both very well written, and a good contribution to this ongoing debate about whether we should just go and have the Surgeon General come out and declare an emergency, that we have just too much activism. No, that's not going to happen, but it's a funny thought. Okay, so those are my highlights of the week.
Damon, you might have won this week's contest for most curmudgeonly take, so I give respect that.
I do that frequently. Thank you.
Tom Edsall, you get to bat cleanup. What's your highlight or low light?
I took 2 highlights. One is a new book called The Wolves of K Street by Brodie and Lucian Mullins, 2 good Irishmen who, Brodie works for the Wall Street Journal, who have written a really very illuminating book on lobbying. It's a subject that has always fascinated me. They have done a job of yeoman work on reporting what goes on, detailing it. It makes for a very good read, and the conclusion has a lot of very interesting material. I really recommend it. The second thing I want to highlight is my own poker game as a bipartisan exemplar. Last night, most of the players are Democrats, but one player came in and said he just took a job on the Trump advance team. And all the Democrats congratulated him on making a good choice for what in a career, being an advance guy, is a very good way to move ahead in the world. It's a perfect stepping stone to meeting people, getting basically to understand the whole political process. This I don't think would happen on the web, but in my poker game, it did happen. And that's what I would highlight.
Well, Tom, people say the uniparty like it's a bad thing, but I think you're showing that here inside the Beltway, we can bring people together across party lines. That's a hopeful sign.
But Tom, what's the bottom line? Did the Democrats take all of this poor guy's money?
No, he was the big winner.
Better you. Okay, now I believe you.
The best poker player I've ever run into was the head of the Federalist Society.
I hear they play a long game over there. Let me do for a couple of lowlights. One is the governor of Louisiana, Jeff Landry, has just signed legislation requiring every classroom in the state to display the 10 Commandments. When I was a kid, a Jewish kid growing up in LaPorte, Texas, every day over my elementary school loudspeaker, they said a Christian prayer and it ended with "in Jesus' name." So every day I was reminded that I was an outsider. So Governor Landry, congratulations. What was done to me as a little Jewish kid will now be done to all the little Muslim and Hindu kids. That is not what America should be. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. So I've just made my point in defense of little Jewish kids. Here we have Joe Biden, from the moment Israel was attacked on October 7th, has done nothing but defend Israel. Joe Biden flew to Israel, hugged Netanyahu, marshaled the world in support of Israel, sent weapons to Israel, vetoed resolutions in the United Nations, defended Israel in the international community, defended Israel at home against the American left. Joe Biden took enormous political damage inside his own party to defend Israel. He did one thing that Israel didn't like, which was he paused one shipment of enormous bombs that tend to cause civilian casualties. Biden said, I don't want to do that because that's going to cause too many deaths in Gaza. For that, this week on Tuesday, Bibi Netanyahu made a video criticizing Biden. Netanyahu did not make this video in Hebrew for domestic consumption. He made it in English and he posted it on YouTube. In it, he said that he told the United States, it is inconceivable that in the past few months, the Biden administration, has been withholding weapons and ammunitions to Israel. He said, Israel, America's closest ally, fighting for its life, fighting against Iran and other common enemies. One small thing Biden did, and Netanyahu goes out in English and tries to embarrass him. I don't have words in English for this behavior by the Israeli prime minister, but I do have two words in Yiddish, and those words are chutzpah and putz. So that is what I have to say about the prime minister's comments. With that, I want to thank our guest, Tom Edsall, our regular panelists, and our producer, Jim Swift, and of course, our listeners and viewers. Mona will be back next week, and we hope that all of you will check back for another edition of Beg to Differ. See you then.